Okay, so what I'm going to be doing in this series of videos is to focus on the TV series In Treatment. Now, In Treatment is a show that is based on psychotherapy sessions, with each episode being its own therapy session. There are several clients that Paul, the psychotherapist in the show, works with in each season, but what I'm going to do is focus on one particular client in each series of videos. And what I'll do is I'll start right at the beginning of when we first meet the client and the work that Paul is doing with this client. And what I'll aim to do in these videos is to try and formulate and understand what's happening for this client, maybe give some understanding of how I view this as a therapist and what I think is going on. And we'll kind of build together as we move forwards with this an understanding of some of the psychological difficulties that the client is facing. And hopefully try and give some psychological understanding to how these difficulties might be there and what I would do as a therapist to help deal with them. Now, like I say, what I'm going to do in this series of videos is start right at the beginning with where we first meet the client. Now, the client I'm going to focus on to begin with is Laura. And what I'm going to do is sort of, as we move forwards in these videos, is build up an understanding of Laura, some of the psychological difficulties that she has, the dynamics between her and Paul, the therapist, and an understanding of maybe what's happening within the therapy. And I'll also aim to give some insights as I move along in these videos about some of the psychological difficulties that she faces and how these psychological difficulties come about. But like I say, we're going to start this right from the first time we meet Laura in the first session. And what I'd really like to know as well from you is sort of any comments or questions that you have as I work through these videos, things that you're observing yourself within these sessions, questions you might have of what you see or from what I say. And that's just going to allow us to build sort of a dialogue together of what's happening in these sessions and so that we can sort of maybe try and highlight as much as possible of some of the psychological things, the emotional and mental well-being stuff that would be really helpful to focus on in these sessions. But let's begin right at the beginning of where we first meet Laura in these sessions and begin to formulate and understand what's happening for her in these sessions.
I told you.
Told me what?
You'd be sorry you ever encouraged me to cry here.
I'm not sorry at all.
You didn't expect it to be like this, I bet.
Like what?
Okay, so as we begin in this session, what are the first pieces of information that we're getting? So there are a few things that I pay attention to with the client when they're sat in front of me. One of those is obviously what they're saying to me, but also another one would be sort of their body language and what they're experiencing as they're telling me this. So what are the things we pick up on from Laura straight away? Well, obviously she's upset and sad. You can see that straight away, that there's obviously some sadness that she's experiencing. But this is mixed in with some words in what she's described here around what it's like for her to express her sadness in the room with Paul. So there are a couple of bits that I would be sort of thinking about in the words that she used right there. Firstly, what she says is, I told you that you would be sorry. So in a sense, what she's saying is that she expects Paul to have a particular judgment on her for being upset. Now, this is actually a defense known as projection. Now, what projection is, and I suppose the sort of the clue is in the name of the defense, is that you project out something onto somebody else about your own thoughts and feelings. Because what you actually hear Paul say is that, no, that's not how he thinks about this situation. So that's normally how you know that projection is happening, is because what you think and feel is different from what the client is imagining you're thinking or feeling, or there is no evidence sort of to suggest that that's what's happening in the therapy session. Now, the reason people normally project is because actually they find it hard to acknowledge that this is their own thoughts and feelings towards themselves. Now, all of this is sort of subconscious, somebody isn't aware that they're doing this. But for me, I would already be sort of clocking this and being aware of it. Okay, there's a potential here that she's going to project particular thoughts or feelings onto me that I really need to be aware of, because there's a potential, if I don't pick up on that she's going to continually sort of think that I'm thinking or feeling things that aren't actually happening in the room, and that's going to impact on the relationship we have. Because what this projection right now is that I'm expecting you to judge me for expressing my feelings. And if you don't do something about that, then potentially that she continues to hold that view about Paul in this session, and the belief that he's judging her for expressing feelings. Paul does the right thing in this, that he says straight away, well, that's not actually true, that he doesn't feel that way. So he's blocking that projection straight away. But with any defences, the likelihood is that they will keep coming back up over and over again. That's kind of how defences work. So this is the first bit of information we have around Laura and her experience with expressing feelings, is that potentially she might expect to be judged. Now this actually gives us further insight into Laura's relationship with sadness and probably her past experiences as well. If she's expecting Paul to judge her negatively for expressing her sadness, the likelihood is that's what she's experienced before in the past as well. That showing sadness to people, probably her caregivers or parents growing up, was a negative experience. And this is something else that you are aware of within therapy, is that what a person expects you to do as the therapist is probably recreate the experiences they've had before in the past. Now, what's great in terms of what you can do as a therapist is that you can actually block this and stop the recreation of that same event happening again. So in this instance, instead of her being judged for expressing her sadness, Paul is in a position right now to actually say, we're not going to judge you for expressing your sadness here, that actually you're perfectly fine to express these feelings. And in a sense, what you're offering her is a positive, healthy relationship that maybe she wouldn't have experienced before. So this is one of the first things that we can hold on to in terms of understanding Laura, is that when it comes to expressing her sadness, that this is a negative experience for her, and she's also going to be expected to be judged for expressing that sadness too.
You know what? It's disappointing. I thought I'd feel better, relieved. I thought it'd be a lot more fun.
And it isn't.
No, it's horrible. I don't know if I'm able to talk today, Paul.
Okay, so again, we're getting some further insight into Laura's experience with expressing sadness. What it sounds like to me is that I get a sense that they've been doing some work on this around her showing her emotions within the session, because what she sort of describes there is that she was expecting sort of the expression of her sadness to be a certain way. Now, that probably suggests that she hasn't actually expressed her emotions before in the therapy sessions, which may highlight sort of a difficulty that she has with expressing feelings. What she's also saying as well is that it doesn't sound like her expressing this sadness feels like a release to her, and actually she described it as a horrible experience. So this is giving us some further information about Laura's relationship with her sadness. Expressing sadness isn't a release for her. I know she described it there as potentially like she thought it would be fun. Okay, well maybe expressing sadness is unlikely to be a fun experience, because normally when we're sad it's because something has happened to us that is painful. But the idea that this is a horrible experience for her, for me, that would suggest again that this is something that she sort of struggles with. Now, again, as a therapist, I might be sort of beginning to think about and formulate in my own mind, why is it that she maybe has such a horrible experience with expressing her sadness? And there can be a few different reasons for this. Is she judging herself for expressing her sadness? Now, you can imagine if you begin to express your feelings and you beat yourself up for it, or you sort of are harsh on yourself, it's going to be a horrible experience. Does she have the capacity to express this sadness right now? For some people, their emotions can feel very overwhelming. So actually when they're in touch with their emotions, that actually it becomes a very distressing experience for them. And normally what would have to happen there is to help sort of build some capacity to be able to express the feelings without being too overwhelmed by it. Partly it might be the fact that, again, she's expecting to be judged from Paul in this moment in time. So again, that also would make it a horrible experience. Or is the horrible experience the fact that actually what's happened to her is horrible, and therefore being in touch with these emotions is reminding her of the horrible thing that she's been through? But again, these are all things that I would be holding on to in my mind, and maybe would want to sort of ask Laura a little bit about this. But again, this all builds up some information and understanding of Laura's. And what we're getting a sense of again is that her relationship with sadness is a difficult one. It feels horrible to express sadness. She hasn't been able to express her feelings before by the sounds of it within the session, and she expects to be judged for expressing sadness. So this all gives us information about the relationship she has with expressing this feeling. The other thing that she says there is that she doesn't know if she feels able to talk today. Now, when I hear that from somebody, what that says to me is that they are already too overwhelmed in the session as they begin, which again, with the relationship she has with her sadness, the distress that she's feeling, and she doesn't know if she can talk today, I would be, in my mind, thinking, okay, actually, we need to put the brakes on right now because she's clearly too overwhelmed in this moment in time. So again, this gives us a bit more information about Laura, that maybe when she's in touch with her emotions, actually it's a very overwhelming experience for her. And that if she starts to talk more, the likelihood is she's going to connect more with the emotions, and that might be too distressing for her to do.
I don't know if I'm able to talk today, Paul. I shouldn't have come. I should just called it off. I'm sorry.
Okay, so let's just have a think about what she said just there. I should have called it off and I shouldn't have come today, and then she apologised to Paul for being there. So what might that be telling us about Laura? Well, what we know so far is that she's clearly overwhelmed and she's in a lot of distress. You know, we know that because of what she said about sort of she doesn't feel that she's able to talk today, the way that she feels uncomfortable and how horrible it is to sort of express her feelings. So we know that actually she's in a lot of distress, and it's, you know, it's very overwhelming for her right now. Now, when you think about it, where is she right now? She's in therapy, you know, the place specifically for help when you are in distress. And what she's saying is, I shouldn't have come today, and she's apologising for being there. So again, this is telling us something about Laura and what she expects to happen when she's in distress and when she's overwhelmed. The fact that she's apologising for being there when she's in distress suggests to me that actually that she believes that showing her distress in front of somebody else is wrong, or at least that she's learned this somewhere along the way, that actually she's doing something wrong right now. You know, that's normally why people apologise, because they believe they're doing something wrong. But of course, she isn't doing anything wrong right now. She's in a lot of distress, she's upset, and she's overwhelmed, and she's in therapy. The absolute best place to be if you are feeling that way. So again, this might be giving us some further information about her expectations of what happens when she's in distress. That somehow that she shouldn't be showing it, that she's doing something wrong by expressing it and sort of reaching out for help. Which again might give us some insight into maybe what her formative years were like and what happened if she was upset or overwhelmed by something, and the way that she was treated by her parents. Now, the way that I would know this is that normally what happens within therapy is that whatever happens within the therapeutic relationship is almost a playing out of what's happened in past relationships. She struggles to show her sadness, she expects to be judged, and she apologises for being in distress. So all of this points to the fact that actually when she's upset or overwhelmed, that she has probably been judged harshly for this, treated negatively and criticised for doing so, rather than being shown care. So what we're building up a picture of here is that Laura doesn't expect to be shown care when she's upset and distressed. She expects to be judged and she expects to be dismissed. So there's a real potential right now for her to be feeling some sense of shame for what she's doing. And I think it's a really important part now within the therapy that, in a sense, that Paul doesn't allow that to happen. That he makes sure that she doesn't feel that way in this session right now, that she has every right to be there, and that she's doing nothing wrong by being distressed in the therapy session.
Are you all right?
Yeah.
Sit down. Sit.
You know, I've been sitting out in the park for about 4 hours.
Here?
Yeah. I wanted to call it off, the session, but I wasn't sure I'd be able to make it home alone. I took a cab here. My car's at home.
So what we're getting an insight into right now is probably an internal conflict that she's facing with being there in therapy. She's upset, she's in distress, and what she says is that sort of for a period of time prior to the session, she was sat sort of somewhere close by to where the therapy office is, and she was thinking about whether or not she should come into the session or whether she shouldn't be there. So in a sense, that says to me that there's an internal conflict here of that she's in distress and something inside of her is saying, should I go and get, and have this help and care from the therapy session, or should I not go there? Now, obviously, it's a positive thing that she decided to come to the therapy session rather than deciding not to turn up. But there's a definite struggle here that she has about showing her distress and accepting care from somebody else. Which ultimately, that's what therapy is, it's a form of care. And the internal struggle she had here is deciding whether or not to accept that care when she's in distress or to not turn up to the session.
Yes. Yeah, my car's at home. It's freezing. Came this close to knocking on your door and asking for a sweater.
When was that?
I don't know, maybe 5 or 6. I can't remember. It was still dark. Waited for the sun to come up. I never waited this long for a sunrise.
Okay, so there's a couple more bits that we can pick up on right now. She's clearly freezing cold. She's been sat outside for she said that she's been sat outside for 4 hours in the early morning. And clearly she's freezing cold. Paul's brought her a blanket over there. So again, this maybe would suggest that she potentially doesn't take care of herself, that she sat freezing cold, and rather than doing something to make sure she was okay, she stayed there. And even in this moment right now, Paul's the one that's brought the blanket over. She hasn't asked for a blanket. Rather, she's just sat there shivering, rather than sort of saying something about that. So this potentially says to me that she's somebody that likely neglects herself, that she doesn't do something that's caring and passionate towards herself. Now, you'd imagine, if you cared about yourself, if you were compassionate to yourself, if you were going through something really distressing and upsetting for you, what you would try and do is make sure that you were okay. You would do something in your best interest. But what we see here with Laura is actually what she did was she sat in the freezing cold for 4 hours, which would suggest that when she's distressed, rather than taking care of herself, she actually treats herself very poorly. Which again would maybe be giving us some insight into her early relationship dynamics, that when she was in distress, she didn't receive care, so she's not used to caring for herself when she's in distress. The other thing that she says there is that she was sat outside the therapy room for 4 hours and she was potentially going to knock on the door and ask for a jumper. So there are a couple of bits we could think about in that. There's a potential here that she's blurring the boundaries of the therapy. Your therapy slot is for 50 minutes a week, and yet she was sat outside the office, potentially coming to knock on. So is there a potential here that she's not going to keep to the boundaries of the therapy? But also, again, there's a push-pull here about trying to take care from the therapy and not. I sat outside and I thought about getting a jumper. I sat outside and I thought about whether I was going to come into the session. So in a sense, what she's constantly sort of in a struggle with here is, do I accept care or do I not accept care? Do I do something that's in my best interest? Do I make sure that I'm warm and I'm okay? Do I make sure I go to my therapy session so that I'm getting the help I need when I'm being overwhelmed? Or do I sit in the freezing cold for 4 hours, and do I not go to my therapy session, and do I neglect myself when I'm in distress? So again, this is it's all fitting in with her potential sort of dynamics and the relationship she has with herself and how she feels she ought to be treated.
Thank you.
Okay, so what would your initial thoughts be on what you've just seen there? So Paul has brought a blanket over for her and put it and wrapped it around her, and she sort of lay down with her head on the sofa right now. So there's a shift in the session at this moment in time. There's a likelihood that she feels quite safe in this moment. It almost feels a little bit like almost like a father-daughter sort of dynamic in this way. Is that that she now feels safe and taken care of. But what we see is that Paul is the one that initiated the care towards her. He was the one that brought the blanket over to her. He was the one that says, you've got nothing to apologise for here. He was the one that told her to stay in the therapy session right now. So in a sense, he's doing all the caring towards her, and we've not seen anything from her so far. I mean, obviously she came into the session, which is some level of care, but actually what we're not seeing from her is her looking after and taking care of herself. So again, in my mind, I'd be thinking, is this somebody that's not used to looking after themselves? Is this somebody that's not used to taking care of themselves? And is there potential that she pulls out sort of a dynamic from other people where they end up being the ones that make sure that she is okay? Because, if she doesn't do it herself, then especially, you think with sort of a therapist, somebody who's in a caring profession, they may likely get pulled into making sure that, that she's okay. So is this a dynamic that potentially plays out, that she doesn't take care of herself, and normally there's a pull from other people to make sure that she's okay?
You know what I did?
What?
I held my cell phone and I watched the minutes go by. It felt like forever for 1 minute to turn into the next. I thought to myself, how stupid is this? Dying on the street like roadkill outside your therapist's office.
Okay, so what do we make of that story that she's just described there? So she said that what she was doing is that she was waiting outside the therapy office, waiting for the minutes to pass. And then what she said was that, how stupid of me to be doing this. Now, the first thing that comes into my mind here is that she's called herself stupid, in a sense, look how stupid I am. And in a way, she's almost inviting Paul, the therapist, to agree with her. Look how stupid you are for sitting outside and not sort of looking after yourself. So normally when I see somebody do this is because what they're expecting is that they're going to be judged, they're going to be criticised. I'm going to criticise myself, and I'm going to expect you to do it as well. I'm going to invite you to think of me as a stupid person. So to me, again, this suggests that Laura is somebody that criticises herself a lot, and she also invites other people to criticise her as well. Again, I am stupid. Ultimately, that's the thing that she's saying here. Now, again, we could say, sitting outside the therapist's office for 4 hours in the freezing cold is not a good thing to be doing. That's kind of quite neglectful. You're freezing cold. You're not looking after yourself. And normally what you see with somebody is that if they're somebody that tends to neglect themselves, they're probably also somebody that's likely to criticise themselves as well. And they're going to try and almost either elicit that response from somebody else, that to hear with the therapist, Paul, I'm stupid, aren't I? Let's all agree together that I'm a stupid person. Or the other thing is that maybe they pull this sort of response from the other person that I expect you're going to care for me because I can't care for myself. And you could go one or two ways with this sort of dynamic. Are you going to be the person that criticises, or are you going to be the person that makes up for the lack of care towards myself? And at the minute, she's trying to pull Paul into these different directions sort of with this. But the other things that I felt in that moment, I felt really sorry for her. That actually, how sad is it that she's had to sit outside in the freezing cold? That she's been in this distress for all this period of time. So for me, there was kind of there was a sense of sort of empathy towards her here. That actually this must have been a really distressing thing for her. But to call herself stupid is a way of kind of dismissing that.
I'm sorry, Paul. I should have called it off. I shouldn't have come.
You should have come here. What happened last night?
Okay, so what are we getting from Laura is that she's apologising again to Paul, as if she's doing something wrong by being there in therapy when she's upset. And again, this is a really difficult dynamic to try and manage, because what she's constantly trying to do is to get Paul to side with her, that she's doing something wrong, that she should be criticised and judged, and actually that she's not deserving of being taken care of. And Paul does a really good job again. He's very firm and says, well, you should be here. This is where you should be right now. So he's not sort of he's not being pulled into this sort of idea that actually that she should be apologetic for being there in therapy. But again, this all fits in with a picture that we're beginning to build up of Laura about how she treats herself, how she expects to be treated, and what happens when she gets distressed. So what we know is that she will potentially criticize herself. She will expect somebody else to criticize her. She would feel that she's doing something wrong when she's upset, and actually she finds it really hard to be in touch with that sadness.
I don't know if I'm able to talk today, Paul. I shouldn't have come. I should just called it off. I'm sorry.
Okay, so that we can see here that even within just a few minutes of meeting Laura, how much information you can gather about a person and their experience and how they treat themselves and how they expect to be treated. Now I'm going to leave it there for this first video because I think there's already quite a few bits in sort of what I've discussed here, and again I'd love to get some feedback from you on your thoughts or any questions that are coming up from this. Now what we know is that obviously she's just been asked about what's happened the night before, so I guess what we're looking at in the next part of this video will be to get a bit of an insight into what's happened the night before for Laura. But what we know already, like I say, is that this is somebody that's likely not going to take care of themselves when they're in distress. So again, we can see if that starts to play out more in what's happened in the night before, and see what we can build up on in terms of getting to understand her and the way that she treats herself, and some of these psychological difficulties that she has.